welcome back. Today, we're excited to talk about a topic that, as we go around and talk to businesses, most businesses, organizations, entrepreneurs, they struggle with this one word called strategy. When you ask them what type of plan they have, they immediately want to pull out their business plan, don't they?
If they have that.
If they have that. So today we're going to talk about strategic planning. And Zach's going to break it down in a couple areas. He's going to share with you some examples and maybe even a story from an organization that we worked with and the kind of growth that they've had. And then at the end, we'll give you some tips and pointers on what to do next. So Zach, let's talk a little bit about strategy. So you're a business today. You're talking to someone that says, hey, I don't know how to grow. I don't know what to do. And I don't have a strategy. Let's talk about what strategy is, why you should have one, and what's the impact.
Yeah, well, let's think of this at a high level too, starting with, okay, what is strategy, right? And I think that's our opportunity from a leadership perspective, again, to take a step back to look, okay, how do we actually take time to work on the business instead of just working in it, right? So looking at strategies, saying, okay, hey, if we kind of take those three buckets you mentioned, right? So there's financial strategy, there's operational strategy, and then there's sales strategy.
So
right?
Three different strategies.
Absolutely. So when we look at kind of our strategic planning process or approach, like those are the three buckets we want to live in, right? Because regardless of where you're at on the spectrum, if we can really look at and tackle your financials, your operations, and your sales strategy, like we're going to have a really in-depth kind of meaningful dialogue and conversation.
So let's sit there for a second. So when you talk about the sales part, the operation part, and the financial part, how important is it to have the right people in the room? Let's start there.
I think it's probably the most crucial element to planning, right? And we've done it on both ends of the spectrum. I've done it where there's just the one owner and that's the only person that, he or she wants in that room and they have all the control. And I've done it where there's, 15, 20, 30 people and a lot of people who probably shouldn't be in the room are involved. But I think it's crucial if you can look around and say, okay, when we do planning, I want the individuals in the room who are going to be responsible for driving action. Right? So maybe that's 2 people, maybe it's 5 people, maybe it's 10 people, depends on the organization. But if you're in that room, to me, it signifies that you're willing, capable, and able to drive action and actually trying to work to accomplish some of the objectives that are set during the planning process.
Okay, great. And so as you do that too, we've talked about this many times. Where should an organization do this? Should they do it? Maybe they have a great conference room, and or should they, have the individual that works for them that they think this person, Bob or Sal or Tom or even Jenny, they could facilitate this, or should they go off-site and then bring in a third party? What's the difference between the two, and what would you recommend?
Yeah. So typically, let me tackle the back half of that first. When we look at, hey, should we lead this ourselves internally and have, our CEO, our president, our manager, whoever kind of lead that planning session, which is, I think, a common idea or thought that gets involved in any organization that's looking to do planning. My typical recommendation is to bring in somebody from the outside. And why I say that though, Frank, is I don't want your president or your CEO or your manager leading the dialogue. I want them involved in it, right? I want to get their perspective on the topics we're talking. I want them to be on the other side of the table, right? Because I want them to be visionary and forward thinking about the company. So I'm always a fan of, even when we do planning, we bring in an outside party.
That's a good point. So even us as consultants on helping you improve your capital, we don't do it ourselves. We bring in another resource.
Right. Because I don't want to be trying to feel like I got to play both sides there. Right. So I always recommend bringing in an outside facilitator, somebody who can help kind of play the role of a guide, who can take you, kind of hold your hand a little bit through the process, but also kind of force you to answer the tough questions, to be involved in and participate. Yeah. Right.
So the other side of it, Zach, so let's talk a little bit about both sides of the house. Let's talk about an example or story for those watching of firms that you've seen not do strategic planning, right? What's some of the financial outcomes there or culture? And then give them an example of a firm that you've worked with or a company that actually did it and what came from that.
Yeah, well, I think the downside to not building a strategic plan is vision. You mentioned culture. Right. And I just think overall kind of trajectory of the organization, right? Not saying you absolutely have to have a strategic plan if you want to be considered high growth. My perspective, I would say, yeah, you're probably going to see more high growth organizations that have a strategic plan than do not.
What about luck?
Well, luck's it's an interesting strategy, not one I want to necessarily put my money on, but
hope's not a plan.
Hope is not a plan. But I think when you look at this, if you really want to kind of take the next step as an organization, you really want to, again, kind of take that step back and say, okay, how do I have a holistic view on my company, my people, my team, our process, our procedures, our goals, our objectives? Like that's where planning comes into play. It allows us to then kind of drive towards that same objective right? Where we can kind of launch into this and say, hey, here's everything we need to accomplish. Here's why we need to do it. Here's who's going to lead it. And then we start executing. Because Frank, to go back to your question, right? The firms that we've seen operate this way and the firms who have excelled in strategic planning and really bought into it, right? There's one organization I worked with who they've gone from a $3 million organization now to $5 million over the last 2 years. Right?
That's good growth.
So it's great growth. Obviously, a lot of it driven by their sales front, but a lot of that sales was also driven by what they did operationally with their people, their staff, and their processes, which led right into their financials and their profitability to make sure they could still fuel this growth and this people element while staying profitable and maintaining a certain profit margin they were looking for, right? So it allows us to be a lot more specific or a lot more strategic on the actions we need to take instead of just sitting back and saying, well, hey, next year we're going to grow, we're going to hire some people. Hopefully it works out.
Yeah. And one thing I want to comment too. So if you're watching this video, you probably want to grow. And we're big fans of things like traction, the E-Myth, Peter Senge's books on organizational development. So we're big fans of that. But like you said, it's just so vital that from our experience of well over a couple of decades of having a third party come in, be off-site, challenge you, help you work in the business and on the business. I mean, just working on it and coming out of there with objectives. And so think about this. When you leave that meeting, would you say someone just has a 12-month strategy, a 3-year strategy, a 5-year strategy, or is it all encompassing?
It can be any or all of the above, right? And what I mean by that is I've done it with organizations who, hey, we want to focus on 3 to 5 years, right? We want to take a look ahead and get to that 3 to 5 year plan. I've also done it with clients who said, Zach, 3 to 5 years, like, man, I'm trying to get through next week right now. So they wanted to say, let's look at a 12-month.
Like
plan.
an L12.
Yeah, absolutely. But they wanted to take a look at it and say, you know what, I don't want to think 3 years when there's way too much going on, way too many changes, especially you look at the COVID element and nobody saw it coming, obviously. And right. So I think you've even seen some firms who said, you know what, let's look at the next 12 months, right? Let's look at this. How do I make sure I've got the best plan for 2023? Right. And then we'll do it again for 2024. Right. I don't think there's any issue or shame trying to look ahead as long as we understand that we're going to need to make some adjustments to that plan.
Yep.
Right. We got to make sure we're monitoring so we can come back and make those adjustments and still execute. Right. But I think you're starting to see a lot more, even just 12-month shorter term focus, because that's where people are saying, hey, let's get through this and we keep building on that. Well,
as we kind of come to a close, what would you encourage folks to do right now that are out there watching this podcast, and why would they engage with iCOR? Like what would you recommend the next steps be?
It's a great question. And again, Frank, so I think on our end, our goal is, I mentioned kind of that idea of a guide earlier, someone who's coming along and holding your hand through the process. That's exactly what we want to do with this, right? When we do strategic planning, our goal is to be able to come in and say, hey, how do we help you kind of structure your goals and objectives? So the first phase is we got to talk to you to get to know you, your company, your people, and your objectives, right? The better we can kind of get intertwined with all those components allows us to really understand where you're trying to go. And when we have a clear picture on where you're trying to go, we can kind of ask the right questions and push the right buttons to help figure out, okay, what's the process that we need to implement, do, or execute on that allow us to get there.
I like that. And so as you wrap this up, one thing we always like to talk about is at iCOR, we're really focused on helping you improve your capital. And what Zach just outlined with you, if you had to break it down, it breaks into these 4 key areas. We'll help you understand what you need to do. So what does your plan need to be? Then to go do it, right? We'll help you come together with those initiatives, who to assign it to, timelines, all that stuff, and then check how that's going over a period of time and then adjust. And, you've heard this, if you've studied any type of strategic planning or engineering, it's plan, do, check, and adjust. So our main objective is to help you improve your capital and help you put a strategy in place to grow. Look forward to talking to you soon.